Hello students, have a safe days, stay indoors and watch the videos. And I'm sure you would have watched Unit 5, the consequences of the war, and all the 5 videos come under one heading, that is the consequences of the war with the different subtitles. And I'm sure each one of you would have read and scored A grade. Well, we start off with a new chapter in history, lesson 2, growth of nationalism. Well, what do you mean by nationalism? In common language, it is oneness, patriotism, love towards one's own country, and so on. But we define it in a better way. People living in a common territory, sharing a common ideas, a political, cultural, and come as one nation. I'm sure you would have understood what is nationalism. So they are sharing a common territory with political, cultural, and they come as one nation. Now, when did this nationalism start? During the second half of the 19th century, as we know that the 1857 revolt ill-treated Indians in all walks of life, political, economic, social, cultural, religious, and all ways of life, and thus the Indians could not take it anymore. They said, we need to fight against them and we need to have independence. So during the second half of the 19th century, a political awakening took place. This is the main point over here. What took place? A political awakening. Okay, all the leaders would have come together, people would have come together in order to say that yes, we need independence for our country, and then finally we need to work for the upliftment of our country. Well, the spirit of nationalism was initiated by the French Revolution with the watchwords which is fraternity, equality and liberty. So what are the French watchwords? It is fraternity, equality and liberty, and I'm sure you can make a short form of it is FEL. Okay, what does FEL stand for? Fraternity, equality and liberty. Yes. So one of the most significant was this, the political awakening, and added to all these things, it is an offshoot of modernization. Okay, what do you mean by offshoots of modernization? Yes, did modernization take place in India? Yes. So the offshoots of modernization was another factor for this. Remember, we studied in socio-religious courses about the introduction of railways and telegraph. So modernization was another factor for this rise of nationalism, which was a boon in disguise for us. Well, in December 1885, the INC marked. What do you mean by INC? What does INC stand for? INC stands for Indian National Congress, which marked the formal beginning of an organized national movement. It was an organized national movement. The British domination and the ill-treatment done to the Indians produced a conducive atmosphere for the growth of nationalism. So how did the British ill-treat the Indians? We were ill-treated in all walks of life, and as we studied in the previous chapter. Now we move on to see what were the factors which contributed to the growth of nationalism in India. Nationalism. So the first factor is economic exploitation. Second one, repressive colonial policy. The third one, role of socio-religious reformers. And the fourth, role of press. The Indians realized that the general aim of the British policies in India was to promote their own interest at the cost of welfare of Indians. The economic discontentment of different sections of society were as follows. The peasants were mainly the victims of the British colonial policies. The government took away a large part of their produce in the form of land revenue and taxes. The peasants were forced to grow cash crops like indigo, cotton, and jute. Remember, we studied this in the previous chapter. Indigo was a main source of income for them, and there were exorbitant taxes which they had to pay, and hence they had to borrow money from the money lenders and the landlords. Why did they borrow money from the money lenders and landlords? Because of their poverty condition. And added to this, there was famine and drought, and the weather conditions and the climatic conditions in India was not very suitable for them, because they did not neither get the artificial supply of water. Now let us see how the artisans and the craftsmen suffered under the British policies. The British policies were not in favor of the Indian trade and industries. The East India Company used its political powers to destroy the Indian handicrafts industries, and India thus became a supplier of raw materials and a cheap market for the finished product. So, cheap market for finished products. Remember, we studied in the economic causes in the previous chapter, and hence it crippled the artisans and the craftsmen, and they were devoid of their livelihood. Now let us see how the working class was affected by the British. Now, how did this particular working class develop? It was due to the modern industries. The growth of modern industries led to the birth of a new social class of people called the working class. And these particular people were exploited, the Indians were exploited by the factory owners. Now, the factory owners were the English people. So what did they do? They asked them to work for long hours, but the payment given to them was very, very less. And the British outlook was very broad. It was covering the whole of India. And thus all these factors made their political thinking far more significant than their numerical strength. Now let us see how the poor educated Indians were affected by the British. The only employment available to the educated Indians was the government service. It was only the government service which was really available for them. And it was too high for them to compete, and their promotions were very, very bleak, as we studied in the military courses. They had hoped that the British capitalism would help to develop Indian productive forces as it had done for Britain. Instead, they found that the British policies were keeping them economically very, very poor. Thus, all categories felt that their salvation lay in freeing from British rule. To achieve this, they needed a platform which gave birth to rise of nationalism. Well, my students, we have seen how the peasants, the artisans and the craftsmen, the working class and the educated Indians were economically affected. Now we shall see the next factor. Well, the next factor is the repressive colonial policies followed by the British. The British had conquered India to promote their own interest, and therefore followed repressive policies to make India subservient to the need of Britain. These became a major barrier to India's economic, political, social, cultural, and intellectual development. Some of the repressive policies, especially followed by Lord Lytton in the year 1876 to 80, one who was a viceroy at that particular time, acted as a catalyst for the rise of nationalism. Lord Lytton held a grand darbar in 1877 in Delhi to proclaim Queen Victoria as the Empress of India. Lakhs of rupees were spent on the event, but nothing was done to Indians who faced poverty and were under the grip of famine. Lord Lytton also introduced the Vernacular Press Act in the year 1878. Now, according to this, it forbade Indian not to publish any material that might excite feeling of dissatisfaction against the British government. But this was not applicable to the British government, and hence later it was repealed by the Lord Ripon in the year 1882. Another repressive policy followed by Lord Lytton is the Arms Act of 1878. The Indians were not allowed to carry any arms for their safety. It has held as a criminal offence. This was not applicable to the British. The maximum age limit for an Indian civil servant's examination was reduced from 21 to 19, making it difficult for an Indian to compete. Another repressive colonial policy was the import duties on the British textiles were removed, which proved harmful to the Indians. The next one is the passing of the Ilbert Bill. The Ilbert Bill allowed the Indians to sue Britishers to the court if found guilty, but later it was repealed by Lord Ripon. This reaction proved counter-agitations by educated Indians, thus proving that justice and fair play could not be accepted from British. Now let us see how the socio-religious reformers played a vital role in the growth of nationalism. Now there were many social reformers, but we shall concentrate on Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Jyotibai Phule. Who was the founder of Brahma Samaj? Can you tell me? Yes, of course it was Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And Jyotibai Phule was the founder of Satya Shodak Samaj. Well, Raja Ram Mohan Roy was against the social evils which were prevalent in Indian society. So he campaigned for abolition of sati, legalization of widow marriage, and condemned child marriage, and he also condemned polygamy. With his efforts, Lord William Bentinck passed a law in the year 1829 which was called as Sati Abolition Act. He worked for the improvement of the women. He wanted to increase their status in the society. He also let out a number of journals which was published in different languages such as Bengali, English, Hindi and Persian too, to raise public opinion on the topics of current interest. And he also demanded a separation of the executive and judiciary as we have in the present day. Let's see the contribution of the Jyotibai Phule. He worked for the upliftment of the poor and the depressed classes. He started schools for the untouchables and private orphanages for widows. He also introduced widow remarriage, fought for the women's right. He was a founder, as I told you, he was a founder of Satya Shodak Samaj, and this a particular Samaj was aiming for securing social justice for the weaker section of the society. The press played a significant role and aroused a strong sentimental feeling among the Indians. Some of the important newspapers that were started in the later half of the 19th century were Amrit Bazar Patrika, The Bengali, The Times, The Hindu, and these particular papers passed a message of patriotism and liberal ideas. Remember, we had learnt about the liberal idea of French Revolution, which created a self-determination. Can anybody name them? Yes, of course. The short form is FEL. What does FEL stand for? Fraternity, equality, and liberty. Okay, what did the papers do? What did this newspapers carry the message? Okay, they criticized the unjust policies of the British government, exposed the true nature of British. It made a platform to voice out the grievances of the Indians. It was also to exchange ideas and made them understand that the world outside and thus shaping their policies and program. Now, who shaped the policies and program? It was the Indians.